Hello, everyone, and welcome to a series of pre-event speaker interviews in the run-up to our World Hydrogen North America Congress. This is taking place in Houston this year on the 31st of March till the 2nd of April. My name is Dominic Coyne. I'm the program director, and I'm joined here today by Mike Hopkins. Mike is a clean tech entrepreneur and thought leader in the energy storage and clean hydrogen space. Mike co-founded Ice Energy, now Thule Energy Storage, and has been instrumental in the development of large-scale clean hydrogen projects, including his work at Bakken Energy. He currently serves as chief advisor for Plus Power, a leading battery storage developer. With extensive experience in energy and law, Mike is a regular speaker at major energy conferences and serves on several boards, including Nalumbo, a nanotechnology company. So, Mike, we're very excited to hear your insights on the future of the energy transition, and we're lucky to have you with us today. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Dom. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I've always enjoyed participating, whether attending or speaking at the World Hydrogen North American conferences. They're just extremely well done, and I think they're extremely valuable to anybody interested in the hydrogen space in North America. As I think you know, hydrogen has been a passion of mine for quite some time. I started off in energy storage, but in more recent years got very involved in hydrogen. It had been, as a person interested in renewables, hydrogen had been I'd say like an academic interest of mine, that I thought this was something that was critically important to decarbonization, getting a solution to those parts of the economy that really renewables and batteries can't get to. We've kind of skipped over heavy industry and heavy transport, basically the things that unfortunately are the biggest polluters. So yeah, I had this interest, which I'd say academic, in that I didn't see anything really happening in this space, but had recognized for quite some time as like, we have to figure it out. We have to develop clean hydrogen. We have to have this solution to the most difficult to decarbonize parts of the economy. And then in, yes, very recent years, I've had the pleasure of getting my hands dirty in this space and trying to figure out how do we actually get these projects going, which obviously is how do you make them economic? And that's, I think, my key interest in this area is I'm past the academic part. I'm not interested in the very fringe applications that are entertaining and interesting, but aren't really doing anything substantive. Interested in big projects that are economic.
Right. Right. Well, just to go off what you're saying there, I am curious if there are some projects that are standing out to you in terms of more easily to make economic. Are there some hydrogen models that are existing that are working better than others? Yeah, I know it's going to be quite regional in the US, but we're in quite a unique position now that I think we've had the honeymoon period of everyone being excited about hydrogen, and now we really want to know where it works. So are there specific areas where you're seeing it's working better more than others?
Absolutely. And I think you're 100% right. We're past the honeymoon stage. It wasn't that long ago that if you went to an energy conference, it looked like a hydrogen conference because that's all that anyone wanted to talk about. And I'd say now, after our recent election here in the United States and the new administration, it's kind of the opposite of a honeymoon. I think there's genuine fear, anxiety in the industry about what's the future, since so much of the excitement about hydrogen was based on historic, unprecedented levels of mostly federal funding, investment in this area. And that now is very uncertain. So yes, times have changed. That said, I'll give you an example of what I think of as a real effective application of clean hydrogen, how you can develop clean hydrogen and use it in an economic way that isn't dependent on giant federal support or giant state support. In North Dakota, which is where I started working clean hydrogen, the origin of that, Dom, is kind of interesting and ironic. I was approached by some investment banker colleagues of mine who wanted to know how they could monetize natural gas that was being flared in North Dakota. And I think they had in mind, relatively traditional uses of natural gas, but the basic idea was if you could stop flaring it, and in North Dakota, you have to produce natural gas to get the oil. All their natural gas is associated, so you can't have the oil unless you take the natural gas. And there's never really been any, I'll say, natural gas infrastructure of any kind at scale in North Dakota. And hence, for years and years, they've just lit it and flared it. Obviously, environmentally, the worst thing you can do. And so if you could put it to some productive use, that seemed like a good thing economically and environmentally. When I agreed to join them in this venture, I realized this is the first thing that we could actually do in terms of clean hydrogen. The cheapest way to make clean hydrogen is take methane, natural gas, reform it, and there's much more advanced reforming technologies like autothermal reforming that gets you a very low carbon product that have very low carbon emissions associated with them. Then you capture what emissions there are and sequester them, which you can do in North Dakota. So, and this was something that the Department of Energy has fully supported, as that is a legitimate, quote, clean hydrogen. It's got a level of carbon emissions associated with the production that's well below the limit set by the DOE on what qualifies as clean hydrogen. And when you do that, you get down to a level of, I'll say, $2 or less per kilogram, which, if you compare that to what most people are thinking about when they think of clean hydrogen, which is green hydrogen, no one really is anywhere close to that right now. You can imagine in the future, but it's like many multiples of $2 a kilogram. So that's the production side in North Dakota. And in North Dakota, you've got this good domestic industry. It's not just North Dakota, but in that whole Midwest area, it's agriculture, it's heavy transportation that goes through the area. So you've got this built-in market, which I'd say, in summary, that's the key to getting a clean hydrogen project off the ground and making money, which is to figure out how do you bring really low cost production to really high quality demand where they need it, either because, as an example, like fertilizer is using methane. You can't make fertilizer from solar or wind or batteries. You needed that feedstock. It's being methane. Hydrogen is a perfect substitute. And when you do that, you have zero carbon emissions. So you have the fertilizer industry. Not the same, but like heavy transportation would be a case where when you get into the long haul trucks, they just haven't come up with a battery that's effective enough, long duration enough, and light enough to be a solution to diesel. Hydrogen can be that solution. So that, I'd say, would be one example. I would tell you that from my perspective, there aren't a lot of examples. There's a lot of projects out there, but as you probably read or heard, a lot of them have just kind of fallen away. People were, I'd say, overly optimistic about what the cost of production would be, and even more overly optimistic about demand. And that's, I think, where you got to kind of come back to reality and say, there's no point in some grandiose hydrogen production project or some grandiose hydrogen storage project if you don't have demand sufficient to more or less fully utilize that production and that storage. They're just not going to happen.
Yeah. That's a very good point to make, and it echoes, I think, what a lot of others are feeling in the industry at the moment, how important it is to build the demand side and work out which industries are going to help this scale. And we're hoping to deal with some of them at the event. We've got a whole stream on that this time round. We'll be looking at everything from mobility to heavy industry to aviation, and even marine based demand sectors. So we're hoping to cover all of them, but an important piece to bring the production to the demand is obviously the infrastructure side, and whether you're using existing infrastructure or whether you're completely creating things from scratch. And I'm sure that will vary a lot across the US in terms of what's already there. You're going to be speaking on this topic in our panel. How do you feel about the infrastructure piece? Do you have opinions that you're looking to get into people's minds about what we need to do on the infrastructure side at the event?
I definitely do. I'm sure that others will too as well. I think for anyone who has had experience developing or trying to develop clean hydrogen projects, they know that of the different aspects, the production or the demand, it's the middle part. It's the transportation, distribution, to a degree, the storage, but that connective tissue between production and demand that is not just the most complicated, and it is definitely the most complicated part, but it's the most challenging economically. Because if you think about it traditionally, if you're just thinking, well, I've got production in this state over here, and there's a great demand for it over in the other state, I'll just like build a hydrogen pipeline from one state to the other, and it'll go great. The costs are astronomical relative to traditional fossil fuel infrastructure. And obviously there's regulatory issues, as there would be associated with any kind of like long-term, long distance pipeline. So when I think about infrastructure, I think first, to the extent that you can minimize infrastructure, that is the best thing you can do for yourself. If you can figure out locations like I gave you in North Dakota, but there's a number of them. If you can figure out locations where you can produce and it can be consumed relatively nearby, you've basically won 90% of the battle. You've avoided this extraordinary high cost and the complication. So I think that's the first focus. The next focus from my perspective is we have this huge, mature natural gas infrastructure here in the United States, as you do in the UK, as you do in Europe. That infrastructure can be repurposed or used by hydrogen to a certain point. It looks, generally speaking, like around 20% that you can blend hydrogen into existing infrastructure and you can use it. And I mean across the whole infrastructure chain. Like you can produce it, put it into the system, you can distribute it, and it can be used like in appliances as long as you keep not exceeding that 20% level. That to me would be an example where for these projects, and there are many of them, that are really almost exclusively focused on producing the lowest cost clean hydrogen possible, but they haven't figured out a good use for it, a good demand for it. To the extent that the natural gas industry can move to decarbonize as to 20% by saying over time, we are going to blend hydrogen into our system up to the limits of the infrastructure. And we'll do that as a decarbonization measure that has virtually no capital cost to them because you're using existing infrastructure throughout the whole supply chain. That would be by far the biggest hydrogen opportunity of any. Now, you're not actually supplying people hydrogen as hydrogen. That doesn't get pure hydrogen to a fertilizer plant so that they can have zero carbon emission fertilizer. But it is a decarbonization measure, and I'd say it's a decarbonization measure that would be on a scale and have an impact that like nothing else realistically could do. I'm involved in a project right now for a utility where we're doing that. Where it gets more interesting is, can you actually then transition to 100% hydrogen? And you have this right now, dramatic capital cost associated with it. Now, if you start thinking of, well, eventually you'll have to retire segments of the hydrogen infrastructure system, are there opportunities to replace natural gas pipelines with hydrogen compatible pipelines? And it's also an area, Dom, where there's tremendous investment because now there's tremendous interest in, can you get much lower cost hydrogen pipelines than traditionally? So I could see these things coming together, but in the meantime, if you want to advance decarbonization and if people can be successful in really driving down the cost of hydrogen, that to me would be a big opportunity for everybody that solves the infrastructure problem by avoiding the infrastructure need.
Yeah, yeah. And you're obviously in a unique space because you've been on the I guess dirtier side of the industries on the oil and gas side, and as you're saying, it's a simple opportunity for them that's not going to cost anything to start blending hydrogen. But just to continue on that optimistic trail of thought, in some spaces it's being said that they think hydrogen could even replace gas in the future and be America's next major export. You mentioned that to get to that 100% hydrogen infrastructure level, there's going to be a lot of investment. What other things do you think are going to be needed to potentially get to that future, assuming it is a good thing and that's where we should be going, of course?
I guess I'd start with, I don't know that that's a good thing. Like, to me, to say, well, we're going to be the biggest producer of clean hydrogen and we're going to export clean hydrogen is a little bit in my mind like embracing this hydrogen economy idea that, well, hydrogen can be used for any energy need, therefore it should be the only source of energy and it should all, hydrogen's perfect. I think the problem with that is, or at least my view, the problem with that is it is inefficient. It is inefficient to use hydrogen where there are better, lower cost, clean solutions. Specifically, if you can meet an energy need with solar, wind, batteries, they are not only much lower cost today, but realistically, they are going to be much lower cost for many years to come. So while it's possible, technically, yes, you could do it. I think it's better to focus on not so much let's be this giant exporter of clean hydrogen and this giant user of clean hydrogen, but be focused on what are the uses of energy that today are basically completely fossil fuel based. And despite the fact that we have had lots of solar adoption, lots of wind adoption, lots of battery adoption, there isn't any of that happening in these particular areas. You mentioned aviation, marine. There's a list. It's not a really long list, but it's a huge energy user. Like the numbers are really big in terms of the volume of energy, and it happens to be the most polluting. And so I guess I go back to what I was saying earlier, which is I think it'd be much better off for the United States, and I think it'd be much better off for everybody in the world, really, to be focused on hydrogen as a very specialized tool to decarbonize really badly polluting industries that aren't going to be decarbonized any other way anytime soon. And to the extent that, like, over time, batteries become more efficient, lighter, longer lived, which I do believe over time they will, for sure. They become solutions to parts of the industries that weren't getting decarbonized any other way. That's great. Then they should do it rather than hydrogen. But in the meantime, if we don't get on with decarbonizing the most polluting industries, like now, forget about climate goals. Like, they're not going to happen. Like, if you just skip over the most polluting parts of the economy, you can't meet these goals. And I think if you're too distracted with hydrogen on all kinds of other ideas, you'll never get to the really important stuff. This is where I think you need government, private industry to come together and say, these are the real polluting problems that aren't getting solved any other way. They need hydrogen. How do we make it happen? In that, like, very, very focused way.
Yeah. It's a good answer, and you've already touched on the next question I had for you, really, because I wanted to ask you about the balance of some people were critiquing the fact that hydrogen and this big focus we've had on hydrogen might divert resources away from more scalable solutions and other renewable energy sources that we could be using. So to build on that, build that out a bit for you, how can we make sure it is being used in the right way? Because you did say yourself, a lot of projects have come and went and they haven't gone through all the way. I've spoken to quite a few people that's been in those situations and witnessed those situations. And we mentioned the start of the honeymoon of hydrogen. Now that that's over, how can we have really smart thinking about where it should be applied best? And as you say, to make sure that if it is better to just have solar, that we just use solar.
Well, I see this as the positive side of the honeymoon being over. The bad part of the honeymoon was people pursuing projects that didn't make a whole lot of sense, or were completely dependent upon grants, subsidies, tax credits. And in that world, you had people thinking we should have hydrogen scooters and we should have hydrogen cars, and the support of hydrogen by government was good, but that was the downside. Is I think it fed into this euphoria and this environment in which like any idea was a good idea if it was hydrogen. I think what you're talking about is like, well, how are we going to like get smart about this? Because we have to. Like, I think part of the honeymoon being over is reality is set in, and we can no longer deal with like irrational exuberance about hydrogen. It doesn't really exist anymore. We can't just assume there's unlimited government money available, because there won't be. And we can't assume that, angel investors, venture capitalists, private equity are just going to invest in it because it says hydrogen, which they did. Like, I saw that happening, that if you said I'm doing hydrogen, they wanted to know how they could invest. I think we're in a way better place, really. It's maybe not as fun for some people, but I think this is a place where actual developers that know how to develop actual energy projects can get to work. They're not distracted. They're not competing for investment from crazy projects disconnected from reality. There's a smaller group of projects, I think, being developed by a smaller group of more experienced developers, and we'll get some wins on the board. That's, I think, how it can be done kind of on a micro scale. On a macro scale, I hope that government policy worldwide will start pushing hydrogen in the very focused way I mentioned about, we want to decarbonize industries across the world that are the worst in terms of pollution and aren't getting decarbonized. That's the use of hydrogen. I'd like to see just that kind of government support, not the do anything with hydrogen and we'll give you a tax credit. I think that very focused way will support real projects and keep people focused the way they should be, which is, how most people in the energy industry, broadly defined, have to operate. You've got to be practical, realistic, and you have to make money. Same is true with hydrogen.
Yeah. I think that's a really good pragmatic approach. We'll see what happens with the new administration and whether Trump will go down that line. I mean, it's anyone's guess. But Mike, I've got no more questions and we're running out of time. So I want to thank you so much for your responses and for your opinions. And for the audience watching, if you want to hear more from Mike, he'll be speaking on our infrastructure panel on the 1st of April. Please do check out our website. You can see the rest of the program there and our speakers involved. Mike, thank you once again for joining me today. Do you have any final remarks for the audience?
No, enjoyed speaking with you. I'm looking forward to the conference and seeing you all there.
All right. Well, thanks again. And thank you all for watching. Please check out our other speaker interviews and we'll see you in Houston.